The simple answer is yes. I think it does have a huge role to play. But I'll make my case for that answer. Um, there's a line. I grew up in the church, so I always think with the Bible. There's a line in the Bible uh, that goes like this: Can two work together except they be agreed? So that's the old King James version, except they be agreed. But essentially it means except they agree. I, and that's such an important line, I think, in how we think about solidarity. Because for me, solidarity means having shared interests, shared objectives, shared standards, and shared sympathies. In other words, that we agree on these things. And they're all, for me, very important things when we think about how research works or research should be done in the field in which we work. And the way that I tend to think about the field is that we are working on inequities and injustices. And one of the things that that requires of us is to work with people who have less power than us. Now, it is not easy to have shared interests, shared objectives, shared standards, and shared sympathies with people who are of significantly less power. No matter how much we want to believe that we do, it's not an easy thing to do. And to my mind, a moment like this, a moment of stress, I think, of tension, of difficulty, as the field is going through, can either put a strain on those relationships and make them even more difficult, or can release those relationships and actually allow them to work even better. And I feel as though the decision is in our hands, how we want to go. But ultimately, to my mind, solidarity and finding ways to ensure that our interests are shared is at the heart of it. And I'll quickly talk about two sets of relationships there. Um, um, there's a set of relationships that's between researchers who are privileged and those who are less so. And often in our field, that will be researchers in the global north relative to researchers in the global south. Not always, but often that will be how that power relationship works. Now, a period like this may put a lot of strain on that relationship because, as it is, a lot of researchers in the global north function, work on soft money, soft funding. And when that funding dries up or reduces significantly, a lot of the efforts and success that I think we've made in the field for moving more towards equity and towards more just ways of relating becomes put in danger. They're having lots of discussion about authorship imbalance and fairness. There've been lots of discussion about sharing or redistributing resources and being inclusive. Those discussions are often easier to have when there is some kind of abundance. When resources strain or are pulled up, it's more difficult to be able to function in that mode. And that for me is one of the ways in which this current moment can really strain those relationships because my sense at least was that we were inching towards a place where we could be more equal in those relationships. So that's for me something we have to think about carefully because I think that will be essential to how we move forward. And then there's another relationship, which is the relationship between those who do research, wherever they are, and the communities that are researched or on whose behalf research is done. My sense is that, and this has often bothered me, is that in a lot of our discussions about solidarity and greater equity and fairness in relationships, we focus a lot on the relationship between researchers, not so much on the relationship between researchers and those who are researched. Because again, what does shared interest, shared objectives, shared standards, shared sympathies look like in the relationship? And my sense, again, in my optimistic mode, is to think in terms of how often attention and accountability can be zero sum. In other words, if I'm paying attention to person A, there's a tendency to pay less attention to person B. Um, and my suspicion or my hope is that perhaps one of the ways to think about how we move forward is to say there have been a lot of accountability directed towards big funding agencies, big research agencies, big institutions, and what they want or what they prefer, which are often not necessarily aligned with what communities want and prefer and desire, etc. Perhaps this period in which things are being shaken up can allow us to reimagine what the relationship and what the solidarity might look like between researchers and those who are researched. And again, that my optimistic mode, which I am tonight, can actually move us closer to a place where we begin to have those shared interests and standards, and we actually have these discussions. And I believe very strongly that how we operationalize solidarity in this moment will depend very much on how clear we can be about the interests we want to share and the objectives and the standards and sympathies that we want to be collective around and about. Because without that, really, there isn't solidarity. So that's how I answer the question.